come on back in and pull up a chair. You're becoming a regular around here. It's good to see you again. Well, we got some treats for you this time. 3 more deaths hot off the press in the many deaths of Laura Bow. We got a historical segment looking at the Civil War history and plantation owners in Nerd Corner. And we'll be taking a closer look at Dr. Fields in Meet the Cast. Alright, let's get started. Now, I've showed this one off a bit before in the intro. In case you're wondering, yes, that is Wilbur over there in the corner. He can also be found in the stables. But if you open the gate without giving the carrot to blaze, boom, you get a hoof in the head, and you are a dead ringer. I'm going to go ahead and give this one a 3 in terms of fairness. It's a little bit unexpected, but not so bad. It at least makes a little sense that a horse might be cranky and rear up and kick you or something. And I'm going to give it a 3 in terms of atmosphere. It's sort of a dangerous place. This one isn't an absurd death, and I guess it establishes that the horse still has some kick to it. So that's a 3 all around. What happens if you decide to ring the bell, but you're not careful about your placement? What happens if you are right underneath the bell and you ring it? Pull, and it comes crashing down. And sometimes you get this little Easter egg, where Laura walks around with tiny little feet before hitting the tree, which is kind of cute. I don't know how you get that. You don't always. Sometimes she just lies there dead. I'm going to go ahead and give this one actually a 2 in terms of fairness. Just because in games like this, if something like this happens, it usually means there's something new that you have to do, rather than you need to position yourself a little bit to the right in order to make it work. So that can trip up a lot of people. But a 4 in terms of atmosphere. I think the place is falling apart, and this sort of shows that off pretty well. And it's kind of neat once you get it right that it just comes crashing down right next to you. This is going to be a 2-parter, just showing off what happens if the elevator isn't on your floor. So if it's below you, and you open it up and step into the grating, well, guess what? That happens. Didn't really know what you thought was going to happen, but that was that. And if it happens to be above you, and you open the grating and step in, nothing. But if you decide to also close the gate behind you, then it comes right down, and you get made fun of by the game, which also tells you you invented the trash compactor, implying that you yourself are trash, which seems mean, but whatever. I'm going to go ahead and average these two, and give them a 4.5 in terms of fairness. The one where you step into the empty shaft, I'm going to call that a 5 in terms of fairness, because, you walked into an empty shaft. You might reasonably think that there's something to find on the bottom floor, but you do have to actually close the gate behind yourself, which there's not really any reason to do to get that depth. So that'll be a 4. So put together, that's 4.5 in terms of fairness. And just in terms of atmosphere, that's a 3 all around. It's a dangerous elevator shaft. I suppose the one where it comes down and crushes you sort of establishes that bad things can happen to Laura at any time, but I don't think we can call that one murder. That would seem like a really complicated, unlikely way of murdering somebody, so that's not a malicious action. She just, presumably the poor colonel is going to wheel off the elevator to find just this pool of blood there. So, that's those. Well, one of the first things we found, as part of the side quest, was the Bible and note to Sarah Crouton. It detailed the family tree of the Croutons, showed that Sarah was born in 1854, and contained a note from her parents saying their end was near, they loved her, and they had hidden something for her. It seemed very fearful. Seeing as it looked like the parents were fearful for their lives, and assuming this probably had something to do with the encroaching Union Army, I decided to do a little poking around. I found a Civil War historian who works for Oak Alley Plantation in Louisiana, who was very appropriately nicknamed the Colonel, that was willing to shed some light on this era of history, and so this part of the game. Here's what I learned. Plantations in Louisiana were almost uniformly sugarcane, just like Misty Acres was. Other crops, such as cotton, didn't fare too well in the humid climate. Almost all plantations would also be situated relatively near the Mississippi, in order to enable it to transport goods by river down to New Orleans. So we can assume that Misty Acres is somewhere very close to the Mississippi River. Now, plantations come in all sizes, but we can assume that most of Misty Acres, probably about 90% of it, is beneath the swamp, as even the small ones had a couple dozen acres. And there would have been facilities for the slaves, places to make or mend most of the goods needed on the plantation. We're seeing just the very, highest point in the plantation. Those two fields we see in the back are not anywhere near enough to be economically viable. The parents of Sarah seemed to be fearful for their lives, but we did find that the Misty Acres plantation property was kept pretty well intact, even decades after the war was over. The bell and armor are presumably in the same place they were when the letter was written. The Bible was still intact in the chapel, and we can see that most of the buildings are still standing and in relatively good order. So, to understand what the Croutons were afraid of, let's look at the situation for plantation owners as the Union Army approached. New Orleans was taken by a fleet from the south in May of 1862, and the acting general in charge of the city in Louisiana itself was Benjamin Butler. General Butler was tasked with pacifying and managing an unruly, sullen population in New Orleans and Louisiana in general. He was wildly unpopular, in large part because of his General Order Number 28, or the Woman's Order. See, women in New Orleans had been harassing, insulting, and just otherwise bothering Union Army and officers and soldiers. So that order declared any woman found insulting or harassing Union troops as legally a prostitute. So they would be treated the same, sent to prison the same, but more offensively would be declared a prostitute. Now, for obvious reasons, the citizenry of New Orleans didn't find this anywhere near as hilarious as I do. And in defense of any Southerners on the boards, I would be upset if my great-grandmother had been declared a prostitute too. Unless she was one. Butler was so unpopular that he was replaced with Nathaniel Banks in December of '62, but not before operations were started to claim the land around the Mississippi River north of New Orleans for the Confederacy. His successor, Banks, who was much less unpopular, which isn't to say well-liked by Southerners, presided over the remainder of these operations. It's therefore likely that the Crouton plantation would have been taken by Union troops during the tenure of one of these two men. If it had been during Butler's time, things could have gone one of two ways. Butler would accept any oaths of allegiance that plantation owners would take, pledging their loyalty to the Union. They would have then been allowed to keep relative control over their plantations, and some were operational and profitable until the end of the Civil War. There was also a substantial amount of grift and corruption in achieving such favored status, but those who could play the game well would keep their property safe. It's very possible that the Croutons were not at all Northern sympathizers, and either wouldn't take the oath or weren't into or good at the game of bribery. In this case, their property, and in some cases their safety, could be in danger by Union troops moving through an area. Troops were sometimes poorly disciplined by their commanding officers when it came to respect for property, and tired, fatigued, and battle-weary troops would sometimes loot or destroy plantation property, and sometimes harm the inhabitants, although not frequently. It's possible that such an army was moving near the plantation, and the Croutons knew they would have to flee, or it's possible that they stayed and put up a fight and were killed. Things weren't much different under General Banks. He tried harder than Butler to curtail the looting and destruction of property, but again, troop discipline was sometimes lax, and frustrated soldiers could easily take out their frustrations on the economic elite of the South. Also, the oaths of allegiance, along with bribes, would not have been effective safeguards, so it's possible that if the plantation wasn't attempting to get safety this way, they might have simply attracted attention to themselves for trying to bribe officers. In either case, if the Croutons had put up a fight instead of surrendering to Union troops, their lives certainly would have been forfeit. What is surprising is that the plantation itself was kept intact in any of these cases. The true story of the Croutons will never be known, but at least we now have a sense of the times in which they lived and some of the stresses they would have faced, and we know possibilities. Thanks again to the Colonel at Oak Alley Plantation for his wealth of historical knowledge and his willingness to share it with us. On today's episode of Meet the Cast, let's take a closer look at the Colonel's doctor, Wilbur C. Fields. Wilbur's apparently been the Colonel's doctor for some time, has visited the estate a number of times, and has the Colonel's close confidence. He has the confidence of no one else. Everyone seems to think that he's a quack, including Laura, and everyone seems to think that he samples his own wares, probably meaning alcohol or depressants that he has with him. Wilbur C. Fields is almost definitely based on W.C. Fields, or William Claude Dukenfield, who was an American actor and comedian. He was born in 1880 in Darby, Pennsylvania, and was most famous for his W.C. Fields character, who was sort of very different from the Wilbur the Doctor character we see in the game. Wilbur the Doctor is one of the only nice people on the plantation, and has good things, or at least neutral things, to say about almost everyone. W.C. Fields the Entertainer was a violent misanthrope who drank heavily. He was, however, supposed to be a sympathetic character. He would frequently portray either con men or hapless house husbands under the thumb of wives or intrusive mothers-in-law. He worked with Paramount and Universal, and some of his most famous films include You Can't Cheat an Honest Man, My Little Chickadee, and The Bank Dick. Even to this day, W.C. Fields' profile and voice remain some of the most recognizable in classic comedy.
And we beside the tree.